Maybe you've already watched one or two of my videos and learned about exciting new topics. But is the information on this channel actually any good? Can you trust me? We'll find out today. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today we are discussing the fundamental questions again. A few weeks ago in the video Are Soft Skills Just Scams? We learned about the dark side of soft skills. I will link to the video in the video description. However, this channel is perfectly reputable and trustworthy, isn't it? You can trust me, can't you? Well, the answer is clearly a no. People on the internet can tell you all kinds of things, and they frequently do. Here on YouTube you can easily find videos that contain false, misleading or even harmful information. And if someone says, oh well, the others are suspicious, but I am perfectly reputable and trustworthy, this is like if you encounter a package in the supermarket with a seal of quality the manufacturer awarded to himself. Of course, I always try to provide good and correct and useful information on this channel. And I'm happy if you have some trust in me and my videos. However, I think it's always important to retain some skepticism and to question the information you receive and to consciously deal with that information. And today I will tell you why that is, and I will describe how I evaluate information. So this is one more of those custom content videos where I don't use sources, but I describe my personal experiences and views. First of all, we have the author or creator. The author or creator is no good proof of correctness, obviously. Saying, oh well, if that person says it, it is probably true, is not a good approach. Now obviously there are some indicators that a certain person is trustworthy and that the information from that person can be relied on. First of all, we have the qualification. For example, you should better rely on the medical advice from a doctor than on the advice someone found on the internet. However, qualification isn't always perfect proof. For example, there are cases where people have obtained academic titles using trickery, and there are some titles that are not protected. For example, everybody can call himself trainer or lecturer or coach, at least in the countries I know about. And the requirements for certain titles are different. So some titles are easier to obtain, while others have very high and strict requirements. Furthermore, experience and or success is a good indicator. If someone has dealt with a certain topic for several years, has written plenty of successful books about it, and is considered an authority on the subject, then this person what this person says is probably to be trusted. However, again, there is no guarantee. For example, there is quite an easy trick to acquire work experience. You just wait until you get older. If you are not unemployed for several years and if you don't switch jobs all the time, then by just aging a bit, you will obtain several years of work experience, and for that you don't need to do anything right and you don't need to be successful in any way. Speaking about success, success is a bit tricky because it depends on a multitude of factors. For example, imagine a scientific book that is great, that is regarded as one of the most important books on the subject, and it's great. However, as a scientific book, it's probably a bit complicated, not that easy to read, it won't appeal to a lot of people, so it probably won't end up on a bestseller list. On the other hand, self-help books, guidebooks, and popular science books that are specifically created to be easily accessible, easily readable, those will appeal to a much wider audience. They might end up on a bestseller list, even though in regard to the information included, the scientific book is better. As for myself, I have very little formal qualification. Now obviously there is no special education for soft skills, but what I would regard as most useful and valuable would be an academic education in either psychology or neuroscience, and I have neither. I have dealt with the topic of soft skills for several years, however there is no proof for that, so you only know that my channel has existed for a little over a year now. And it is a rather small channel, so I wouldn't call it a great success, so there are very few indicators for my trustworthiness. One very important aspect we should keep in mind in regard to the author or creator is that if someone presents false or misleading information to you, this doesn't necessarily mean that there is ill will or bad intentions involved. That person might just not know better. Maybe that person misunderstood something, or maybe that person was presented with misleading information and didn't notice it. So if we turn this around, it means if there is a person we completely trust, a great person, perfectly trustworthy, would never intend to harm us, has a great character and whatever, this doesn't mean that everything this person tells us is the absolute truth. They might tell us false and misleading information without knowing, without any ill will or bad intentions. A very important question to ask is that of motivation. What does the other party gain from presenting information to us? The author of the book or the creator of the video? Usually what they want is to earn money. In my case, I don't earn any money yet because the channel is too small for that. However, I obviously still would like to get a lot of views and a lot of subscribers, so there always remains the question: did I rate this book as very good because it is in fact a very good book, or because it is a popular book and I didn't want to disappoint all of its fans? Did I present a certain topic to you because I believe it is relevant and useful to you, or because I think it will be popular and be clicked on a lot? You can never be sure. One very important aspect are sources. If sources are explicitly mentioned, for example, if there is at the back of a book a list of the literature that was used, or if sources are mentioned in the description of a video, this is a very strong indicator of good and trustworthy material, because it adds a lot of transparency. It allows you to check out where this creator got his information from and in what way he used that information, and you can look at the sources and read the books that this person used and so on. However, again, there is no guarantee. First of all, sources can be total rubbish. There are plenty of books that don't contain any worthwhile information, and if I buy and read and use such a book and list it as a source, my material will still be pretty useless. Another thing that can happen is that I have a book as a source, or anything else as a source, that looks perfectly fine at first glance. Let's say it's a scientific book written by an authority on the subject and everything fine. However, it turns out that this book is outdated because in the years since its publication there have been very important new findings that have proven what is in that book to be false and outdated. This can also happen. Another thing that can happen is that I have a source that is perfectly fine and it is up to date, but my material still has deficits because I didn't properly understand the source and I incorrectly forward the information to you. I describe it in the wrong way to you. Another thing that can happen, and this is especially tricky, is that my material looks perfectly fine, my sources are great, but there are still deficits because an important source is missing. Let's say I make a video about a psychological topic and in that area there is one book that is regarded as the standard volume about this topic, written by the most important authority, frequently used by all researchers, psychologists and so on. But I don't know about this book, I don't have it, I didn't read it, I didn't use it. So my material ends up being lacking, ends up having deficits. And this is very difficult to figure out because you wouldn't notice unless you are an expert on the subject. I always try to list all my sources to provide proper information to you. I think I'm doing fine for the literature. I could maybe do a bit better in regard to online sources, but I always try to list all of them to provide transparency and to allow you to have a look at the materials I used. Another important aspect are facts, theories, and opinions. Now, what are those? Facts are things that are proven, such as the current state of research. This doesn't necessarily mean it's the absolute truth, because obviously the current state of research can change if there are important new findings, new discoveries. However, let's say it is as close to the truth as we are currently able to get. Theories, on the other hand, are not proven yet. They might be in the future. There are some indicators that they might be true. The theory hasn't been disproven yet, but there is no proof so far. And finally, opinions. Opinions are my personal, subjective views and feelings and thoughts about a subject. So opinions can never be wrong because they are true for me. They are what I really think and feel about something. Now, a good indicator for good and trustworthy material is that there is a clear distinction between facts, theories, and opinions. It's not necessary for good material to just rely on facts. For example, there are plenty of YouTube channels where people just describe their views and their opinions, for example in vlogs, and this is perfectly fine. It's only problematic if opinions and theories are presented as facts, as the truth, even though they are not. This is a problem. Now, this is often difficult to figure out because to tell apart facts and theories, we need a lot of knowledge on the subject. Sometimes there is a smooth transition between the three, so this isn't always easy. I always try to distinguish between them as good as I can. For example, if I mention my own opinions, I always try to say, I think, I believe, in my opinion, from my point of view, to distinguish my opinion from material I quote from or I describe from sources I used. But I think I probably didn't do it perfectly each time. Finally, we have an aspect that is probably overlooked a lot, and that is effort. Because good material requires a lot of effort, a lot of time, and we only have limited time. Think, for example, about the book reviews I frequently do that are quite popular. What I do is I read the book, obviously. Sometimes I look up the author on Wikipedia, especially if it is a famous person. And if I have plenty of time, I always do a little internet research to see what other people said about this book. And book reviews turn out fine. As I said, they are quite popular. However, imagine I would try to do a perfect book review. I would try to do it as good as is possible. First of all, I would have to deal with the author's life in much more detail. If it is a famous person, I'd have to read a biography. Then I'd have to read not just this one book by this author, but all publications by them, to make sure I can understand how this specific book fits into the entirety of their work. And I'd have to read all the sources they used to make sure I could understand how they used those sources, which ideas they used in their own material, and to understand how this book fits into the general topic. And as you probably notice, this would be an excessive amount of effort that is pretty much impossible to actually do. If I would do it this way, I wouldn't release one video each week, but I would, after more than a year, still be working on my very first video, and I probably wouldn't even be halfway done. So in the end, we always end up with a compromise. Material that we create, be it a book, a video, or whatever, is always as good as it can be in the time we have available with the resources we have available. So this is important to keep in mind. All material you consume, it will never be 100% perfect because no one has unlimited resources available. There will always be some deficits. So, what is the conclusion of all of this? The world is bad, everyone is out to get you, and everybody lies to you. Well, I wouldn't say that. But I think it is important to always be a bit skeptic, to always consciously deal with any information you receive, with things you read, with things you hear, with videos you watch, to consciously question and think about the information you receive, and to not just believe that everything you hear or consume will be correct and will be the truth. If you encounter any mistakes in my videos, please feel free to let me know in the comments. I'll be quite thankful, and it will also be helpful to other viewers. And if you don't find any mistakes, please still feel free to write a comment. I'm always interested in your feedback. If you enjoyed the video, you can also just click on the thumbs up to give the video a like. And you can't go wrong by subscribing to the channel, believe me. We will see each other next week, where we discuss Schulz von Thun's method for communication that is appropriate to the situation. For today I take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.